Welcome, everybody. We are here at Over the Mountains with Rufus Pollock, and I am Sylvie Barbier. You are listening to our episode today where we're going to explore our sense of what is this second Renaissance emerging. What are the elements of this new paradigm? And before we get started, we really want to say it's not like it's something emerging. It's a sense making. It's not like there is completely firm answer, and also that this is what we are feeling into, what we sense that wants to be born. Um, so in the last episode, we covered what were the views and values in the ideology of modernity, which encompass, I would say, I think was 5 elements of individuality and freedom. It encompassed material growth. It encompassed rationality, secularity, and equality. These were the 5 that we covered in terms of like what were the views and values and ideological frame of modernity, and we're still swimming very much in that. And we're experiencing this kind of decay phase of these ideological points. And so something else is also emerging in that. And in Over the Mountains, we want to see how to go over the mountains into this emerging new paradigm. I will maybe share a little bit more in personal stories. In this world that value material growth, I think many of us saw that we were sold that the more you had, the happier you would get. You know, there were films in the 80s, 90s of people just getting rich and finally they're happy. And it would really encourage this material wealth. And it seemed to me, I grew up in the northern suburbs of Paris, and I can testify that definitely material wealth makes a difference to some level of happiness. Prefer to have rich people's problem than poor people's problem, I would say. And yet, I also met very wealthy people and some of them were in my family, and they seem really unhappy, full of suffering. So it really crumbled that sense, that ideology that, money is the only path to happiness. It might be a section of it, but it's not the only one. And it got really clear to me that actually wisdom was a key element to happiness. Um, and I was very lucky to be raised by my mother. And I would say that my mother is one of the people who has a lot of wisdom. She's not a full sage, and yet compared to many people I've met, uh, she has a lot of wisdom. And how does that wisdom show up in my mother's life was that she didn't hold resentment. Um, she was able to forgive. Um, she had a sense of abundance, and also a long-term view for not just herself, but others, and generosity. It's hard to maybe discuss exactly what that would look like. Um, and she really cared for others. And so it seemed to me that our society did not seem, although wanted to be happy, we rarely pursue wisdom. You know, you don't see, like saying to young children, uh, like, okay, wisdom is the path. What you really want to do is like cultivate wisdom. Then the whole question would be, once if we agree that that's something we want to cultivate, how do you cultivate wisdom? But it seemed quite clear to me that wisdom would be something of we say each generation dream a dream for the next generation. And so in a way, this is my dream. I dream. I am dreaming of a world where children and everyone would really want to pursue wisdom together. Um, and maybe now I can ask you, Rufus, is there, what is your dream? And that's how more I would frame, because in sense making and creating a new paradigm, a first act is like an act of dreaming, an act of imagination, a collective dream and a collective imagination. And that dream needs also is like has to be grounded in reality.
Yes. Yes, it's a pragmatic utopian. It's the dream and it's also feet on the ground. Well, I think the simplest starting point for me was being at school and seeing kids be mean to each other, seeing some children bully other children in my class, seeing me be bullied a little bit, or more like friends of mine being treated that way, or people I cared for, and imagining what would it take to have a world where that didn't happen. And I think to pull on the thread, because I think that's where I often start. It's often say, "Oh, we'd love to have a world with no war or no one goes hungry." It's easy to say those things, and then the question is, well, how would that come about? And what we're trying to share in this series is that those things I think we feel trace back to the kind of the cultural paradigm that we're in. And so in this case, one, I also was coming towards wisdom, and I suppose wisdom for me, you described your mother. I maybe always had this more epidemiologist abstract view, given my mind, which was to think, what would it, what kind of people, what kind of communities would have the capacity to overcome the collective action problem? And that's what I saw in that childhood playground. If a group of us had stood up to the bully, if a group of us had stood together, the bully would have been disempowered. We wouldn't have needed to even do anything to him. He just would have lost his power to make fun of, to tease, to humiliate, to hit and hurt others. And we didn't often, even though I remember trying to persuade other children at quite a young age, I must have been 8 or 9, that we should do that. There was a failure of that. And I suppose wisdom for me, for example, is this partly is this capacity to maybe it's a capacity of love and care, because that's what would have motivated us to act. It's only what I felt in my heart, which is maybe I saw myself in others because I was sometimes, you know, I was a little bit weird a kid and so on. So there's love and compassion. And then there's the wisdom to see that we need to act together and how we can act together to make things better. So I think that that's what I mean is this actual wisdom. And that also has aspects of maybe we could say into being or love or compassion this, that somehow manifested. It's not just an abstract love, it's a love that uh, makes us to act. And it's a love that I think is moving. It's like a God's love or a loving kindness of the Bodhisattva, in that it's not just the love of my child, it's the love of all children, it's the love of every being, every rock, every plant.
Mm. And yes, I think this is a good segue into um, another value, which is interbeingness. Um, that, it's like the love of every child, not just your child. But if your child is not well, then my child can't be well. If there's a child in the school that is really suffering, then that suffering is going to be expressed on the school playground, and your child is going to suffer from that. Or if your child suffer, it will also act and cause suffering to others. And that actually our interbeingness is not just with human being, that our interbeingness is with the earth, with all living, and also the non-living. Our interbeingness is also in multi-generation, the past and the future, that we're connected with our ancestors, and we're connected with the unborn and to be born. We're connected to the earth, and so the interbeingness, I think, is also a route into beyond anthropocentric, to sense that we are a living organism with the earth, uh, with all, and that therefore that sense of separation and self is an illusion, that our life depends you know, on the plant we eat, on the animal we eat, on the stone that gives us shelters in our houses, on the trees that we cut to warm ourselves. When you're alive, you have to eat, you have to eat the plant, but it is how you eat, how we consume.
Mm,
It's like once you're alive, you have to you are consuming, but is what is your relationship to it when you're consuming? Are you doing mindfully, present to that gift, the life gift that has been given to you to support your living, and therefore in exchange you also want to support um, living and honor that life, or is it that we're doing it mindlessly? And I think in this interbeingness really has this like is an act. The interbeingness is the act of love, is an act of care, is being connected to our sensitivity that is actually present in most children when they're given the condition to stay connected with the love of life. When they stay connected to, oh my God, I don't want us to cut trees. I love trees. Oh my God, I don't, what wars? I don't want that there is death and war. And actually, that's present in all of us. Um, but often we don't let ourselves be touched with how much we love the world. Because when we let ourselves be touched with how much we love the world, because we are the world, like it almost hurts. Um, and I think the interbeingness is allowing ourselves to really feel that connection with all of it. And the healing that needs to happen, that transformation, has to be like, at least for me, I sense that value, and not just an abstract value, but letting ourselves connect with the interbeingness with all of life is a key element. Um, And again, I want to really touch that this act of dreaming for the good, is an activation, is a collective dreaming, is like uh is a giving. And we I feel like it, dreaming is a muscle. Dreaming is something that is extremely powerful, that comes into reality. There's many shamanic practice of like you have literally dreams, and there's a sign and you take action from that, like letting our subconscious love touch us. You know, I think there's this beautiful myth and story of a dream of how Mexico got started, which there was this dream of an eagle taking a snake on, I think, a cactus or something like that. And that happened in the middle of the lake. And they were like, okay, that's where we're going to build Mexico City. And so similarly, there has been, or we're living the dream of our ancestors of like, there was this dream that no less women would die in childbirth. And so what are the dreams that are touching us that other generation will get to live? And it's an act of love to the next generation and to our humanity and to the living. um I sense also, we touch on interbeingness, uh which implies being beyond anthropocentric, sensing ourselves as a whole living, part of a whole living body, that goes beyond human and also across generation. One, that we sense that there's been a lot of suffering arising from capitalism, and so there is that sense that therefore our economical system, how it would organize itself, would go beyond capitalism. um, and I love how you said that, oh, being an economist is just understanding how plumbing works, in a way of like how the flow works. And so what is it that you're putting that at the service of? And I feel that it would be an economy more at the service of life. And it is really clear that currently our economic system is not honoring, is not at the service of life. Um, and so what would be an economic system uh, that would allow the interconnection, the exchange, uh, but in a way that flows, the energy flow in the service of life, because money is like, my mom would say, money is energy. It needs to flow. If it stays stuck in one place, like it's like being constipated. It needs to flow, like it needs to go to where life wants, where um, uh, there's also one we've been sensing about being able to like hold complexity, and I might want to hear a little bit more your sharing of that dream of what it means to be able to hold complexity, and I might say also a little bit more after.
Yeah. I mean, so just to recap, I think that just as we've thought of key aspects of the ideology of modernity, we're thinking about what would the emergent paradigm or paradigms, we don't know what they look like, but we've been thinking of maybe key features that are likely to be there. We've mentioned wisdom, interbeing, going beyond capitalism and socialism to a new system in the service of life, and also the ability to hold complexity. And I think the other one is the return of the sacred and even of religion. So regarding complexity, some of these overlap. One is, I think, going beyond a kind of dualism is one aspect of that, of like something either is this or that, to be able to hold paradox again. Um, I mean, as a Buddhist, this is really cool, but in general, I think that we actually get trapped, like mind body. There's either, there's this mind body dualism. Either it's the body or it's in the mind, or um, our consciousness is either the soul or it's somehow in the body, but it can't be both. Things are constantly both. There's being and non-being. When was my son born? When did a cloud die? Many of these things, if you really look at them, you start to see that these contradictions of being and non-being don't really make so much sense. And so I think
Yes,
that's
like
one of the examples of
question.
complexity is quite, and the other sense of complexity is just to be with complexity, be with our uncertainty about things in a more wise way. One of the things in modernity is the desire to have certainty. So one of the things that shows up is that we only really, what only matters is what can be measured. When I think it's completely clear to us that there are many things that matter, like love, friendship, the sacred, the living, that can't be measured. I mean, again, I think it's important. Part of wisdom, by the way, is to include reason and science, not to judge them, not to say we're only going to go back to what we somehow can intuit, but just to realize that there are limitations to them. So we can measure the living in a little bit of a way. We can use science and use empiricism to feel the living. How big is the earth? How many species are there? But to really sense the living is something beyond certainly the reductively rationalist mind. So again, I think this one part of complexity which close to wisdom is this enlargement of what we consider, and not to be narrow in like we only what exists is what can be precisely perceived. When the more specific sense of cognitive complexity, which is more generally, the simplest example I can give of that is that I think it's from Susan Simard's book about her work on forests and people generally. And like at the beginning, the simplest version is I I'm planting my little conifer trees that I want to grow up to be my industrial forest. And every other tree that's around must be competition for that tree. And so logically, in a very kind of modernist mindset, I'm like, I want to kill I want to get rid of all the competition. And that way my tree will grow the biggest. So I will go and spray basically pesticide all around my tree to kill off everything else. And then I think a more complex, it's one example of a step into complexity, is to realize that there's causation in two directions. So yes, there's a competition aspect of other trees, but there's also a support aspect, which is that we now realize that other kinds of trees, like maybe even other species, are actually exchanging nutrients with the tree we want to grow. And if we take away all those trees, there's actually really important missing from the environment that will help these trees grow. And then in fact, it might seem odd, but allowing other trees to grow up, and yes, they are using some of the nutrients that could be used, but they're also supplying nutrients to my tree. So even that aspect of moving from a linear type causation model, competition, bad, let's get rid of the competition, therefore, and spray, glyphosate all around, to, oh, there's two directions of interaction, and therefore there's kind of an offsetting. And so just even that move from a kind of a linearity of causation to an ecosystemic way of seeing, and not just ecosystemic way of seeing our world in that example of the forest, but of much of our environment.
Can I
And now
add? Thank you so much. Sometimes I interrupt Rufus
that's
because,
good. It's
like,
good.
um, first I want to take a little bit back because you said like there's an aspect of like um non-duality, and you start talking about being and non-being, like just a moment, because like you're like, I'm like, wait a second, you're opening a big box and you're skimming through it as like, you know, I think it's really important to take time first on that point. When was your son born? That's a very deep question. Where were we born? And Etienne, our son, was he born the moment he came out of me? Was he born the moment there was this like desire to have a child? Was he born in the moment, like he existed in the womb? Like, and he might have existed even before as a desire, as a dream. And I would say the manifestation, like and I can often ask, like, where was I uh, before I was born? And where will I go? Where do we go once we die? And these are very profound spiritual sacred questions, which touches that sense of duality of I exist and I don't exist. I am not. I am separate. There's an I that is separate from the others, which therefore that non-duality actually also touched this point of interbeingness. And I like what you like in non-duality or complexity is that there is a complexity of like, when does things appear? When does things don't appear or disappear? What are things? And to be able to hold like there is an Etienne and there is maybe no Etienne in some ways. And we want to have things simplified because then we can navigate and we don't have to deal with like uncomfortable feelings of uncertainty. And I think that's also very important politically in terms of like, well, currently in the political situation we are in, that, who's quote unquote right? While maybe different people and that complexity of being able to hold that stereo listening of like, oh, there's all these different point of view, and it feels more comfortable to just go and take one side. It's like they're just totally right, and these people are totally wrong. But like holding the complexity of maybe everyone, and I think in postmodernity, that's why postmodernity is like maybe everyone has some, maybe not the truth, but some part of the truth. And the complexity is like dealing with that complexity that, oh, you know, for example, there is a true like there's something of a beautiful dream of in the postmodern area around the gender question of like that people have the ability to create, be self-creating, decide for themselves who they want to be, and yet there is also maybe a side of the truth that the more people who are more conservative also want to hold, that the reality of the our biology. And how do you hold these two together and to not start separating and accusing, or like there's so, and that really takes being able to sit with things that are uncomfortable. And then how do we order that? How do we feel that both of them are holding a section of the truth, but where do they belong? Where do they find homes? Because partially in postmodernity it's like, oh, every truth is valid, like there is no truth which allows everybody truth to exist. And there's something right in that of like seeing that there's a multiple perspective, but yet in this multiple perspective it creates a complexity and a richness, and how to recreate sense of like order, because the universe is both completely chaotic and totally full of orders, in the sense of like there's a movement, a cosmic movement that is both chaotic and orderly. And so it's like being able to like kind of find the order in the chaos, um, in that complexity. I could say more, but I noticed that you put your finger.
Yeah, well, I just want to say to summarize, I think it's very important this point. One aspect of maybe complexity and maybe wisdom would be you both can see multiple perspectives, so moving into a multi-perspective sense, and yet not being lost in a what I could call um like a sea of perspective. Then you're just lost. Like, what is the truth? That there is the return of the truth, we think. So in postmodernism, as you're saying, we maybe lose all the sense of the truth, other than the truth that there is no truth. But in the second renaissance and emergent, what's being born in that, the paradigm being born in that period, there's the return of truth while including this truth of multiple perspectives. And somehow it's difficult to say what that is, but it is this ability to reintegrate, to be integral, to recombine, having seen all those perspectives, into again a sense of the up. Maybe not having the truth, that is always maybe out of reach, but a sense of that there's truer and falser. And I think that's a really good point that you're making.
Yes. Well, I guess there's true or falser. I don't like that term, but it's more like there is each person hold that, but where should it be placed? Is like a house that has different things, and they be like it's very confusing if, like, let's say the ketchup is not put where it's meant to be, like um and it's like I'm cooking, I'm looking for the ketchup and it should be in the fridge, but suddenly it was put in the pasta shelf. And so there's like, I don't know if this is the right metaphor, but there's a sense of like, oh, they're all useful views and they hold a section of the truth, but it's like misplaced. It creates chaos. Uh, in the right place, it actually is a contribution to the whole. And it's like being able to find where the order, like that order, cosmic order is, allows it to be a contribution and keep the cosmic movement. And we're a bit in this phase of chaos right now. And chaos is part of the cosmic order. Having a moment of chaos where you refine order is part of the movement. And right now, we're a bit in this chaos of like everything is like being open to being questioned. And that's part of like that's part of refining order will come. I have this intuition personally, at least, that the an order will an order, not in terms of like an imposition, but like a harmony
A
will
coherence.
emerge, a coherence and a harmony will reemerge out of this chaotic phase. And is to and in that is like holding the a center, being able to hold a centered with this kind of explosion of perspective. And it is a very uncomfortable feeling. Um, yes, that would be the point around complexity. Um, and then you mentioned the sacred, the return of the sacred slash possibly religion, and that's one that we've also, many of us in the sphere has noticed. Basically one of the suffering that has led for many human beings to be disconnected from the sacred and religion, to something bigger than the human, to the mystical dimension. And that I think often with secularity, we've gone one way, and is at times hitting, there's a reactivity in hitting, you see fundamentalism, extremism that has a rise. Religious extremism has arisen, and I think that's partially a reaction to the fact that we've gone quite deep into the secular path. Uh, and when we're mentioning the sacred and religion, there's a real question of like, what is the religion of the future? In the sense that also learning from the pitfall of past of how our religion had functioned and turned into dogmatism and it, like created oppression and being politicized and weaponized. A return of the mystic, and there is a thing of the I think that might be one thing that for many people is both exhilarating and extremely scary because there has been so many abuse of the sacred, the mystic, the religion. My mom, who's a Christian, has said like maybe we need to edit the Bible because parts of it are misogynistic and homophobic. And then when we touch that, then it touches to the point of like, well, what is sacred in a sense that can't be touched? What is really the essence?
Yeah, I do think that here integral has so much to offer. Just maybe for people listening, may be very familiar or not, but I think we want to distinguish the sacred and the mystical, and these profound the profound sort of truth of that I think throughout history people have sensed, and how it gets expressed in a cultural form. I mean, almost most people agree that the very essence of the part of the sacred and the term mystical is because it cannot be said in language. The what one touches, the experience of it is transrational, it's transcendent. And yet, obviously, it then finds some expression in language and ultimately often in institutions and forms. And so I think one really wants to distinguish between that kind of the sacred is eternal, has been there in all cultural paradigms, has been manifesting. The question is, how will it manifest in the second Renaissance? That's what one is really asking here, right? Because one's not saying, oh, it's not just that, it's not just the sacred has always been there. People have always been sensed.
I don't, for me, I didn't feel that where I grew up, at least, that the sacred was at all present in culturally in modernity.
Right, but yeah, right. But so that's what we're saying is how it manifests. So explicitly in modernity, we reject the sacred as being acknowledged as real or as important, even as potentially real or important. Yet many people throughout modernity continue. Many people still either they go to church or they do New Age religion, all kinds of things. I'm saying so what we're trying to get at in terms
Yes.
of the return of the sacred is the
Yes.
return of this.
I would like to add one thing to what you say. I know I'm interrupting, but one thing that you said is like, how is it expressed? Maybe you can say that in modernity, it's expressed with like the oath that doctors take of like that they have to heal no matter who comes into their cabin. They have to they take an oath.
Yeah, but that the Hippocratic Oath goes back thousands of years. It's not modern, just as an aside.
Okay,
The
but
Hippocratic,
that's
yeah,
why I'm
yeah,
asking. I'm
yeah,
like, okay,
yeah, yeah.
what would be the
But
expression of
but
modernity
obviously, we
relationship?
talked in our previous episode that often it's been sublimated, I would say, into technology is the most obvious one. So, like it's kind of, I mean, just take an aside example, Octavia Butler, who's this incredible, I think, science fiction writer, African American woman. Yet the kind of almost religion in her book, the Earthseed books, is of going to the stars. The religion of the society there, that this kind of savior religion is that we will go out and build spaceships and go to the stars. That is our religion in a way of modernity we've talked about, and of kind of growth almost as a religion and materialism as a religion. But what I'm trying to say is the return of the sacred is a bit more specific here. It's both a re-acknowledgement of its reality and of mystery and of its fundamental importance in human life. And therefore I think of its centrality in some way in any well human society. They can't be dominant. We quite want to acknowledge that and it mustn't be oppressive or dogmatic. But there is an aspect where when we have when we drive out the sacred, but what we kind of saying is it doesn't mean going back to traditional religion, of course not, because that's a cultural. I mean, in fact, traditional religion was mostly even pre-modern, or in its cultural form. The question then is, what does a meta-modern second Renaissance teal integral or whatever religion look like? Um, Now, and there can be versions. One could imagine, I think you're pointing to, any one of the world's existing major or minor religions, from Christianity or Islam or Buddhism or the Baha'i faith or Zoroastrianism or whatever. You can imagine evolved versions of them. So just as you can, there are many Christians who are essentially panpsychists. They don't see God as some kind of guy in the sky giving orders. It's like God is everywhere. God is the ground of being. So we can imagine any one of the major world religions, I mean, some more easily than others, evolving into a form that plays this role. But I think one of the things we're emphasizing is that I think, at least when I speak for myself, there's somehow the return of the sacred both in our culture, in the you know what we think, our arts, our creation, you know the spiritual and the religious returns to art, for example, and that it returns in a more actual societal form, that it plays a more explicit role and a more acknowledged role in forming what we're doing. And we've talked before that really every society does have a religion of things that they take on faith and which give them an ontology, an epistemology, and a morality. So that would mean what is real. So, 1,000 years ago, well, what's really real is God, and what's really real is heaven. And in some Christian faiths, even slightly heretical ones, was like this world isn't even real. It's a kind of an illusion run by Lucifer, and the Matrix, the previous version of the Matrix movie, and the medieval Matrix, and that it gives us an epistemology. Where does truth come from? Truth comes ultimately from God, and then through other things, and then it gives a morality. Well, what we should do, or we obey the Ten Commandments, or in Buddhism, what's really real is the ultimate dimension, but the real and the ultimate interpenetrating, so on and so forth. And so we have that today. We have our religion. What's real is matter. Atoms bumping into atoms. How do we know things? Through empirical science, but data and analysis. And what is the good? Well, what gives you pleasure, and what avoids pain. And so the question is the religion of the future, and the religions, I should say, in plural, of the future. Because it's not like there's going to be one religion. We want to keep emphasizing this, but it's that there are underlying patterns to that. Just as we go back 2,000 years, lots of religions are kind of monotheistic or having like certain patterns. They might be different. What are the patterns of today? And it's like, so acknowledging the kind of things we're talking about. I mean, one even is that we talked about complexity of nuance, the acknowledging the unknowable and the transcendent. And yet trying to be able to say that doesn't mean that it can't be spoken about, just as great art and great poetry does point to the transcendent. Just as, the Buddha says, my teachings are a finger pointing at the moon. They are not the moon. But those things, again, we need to be sensing the sacred and the ground of being. And somehow great art, great buildings, great things we make point towards it, and not even point towards it, in somehow embody it or channel it or connect to it. And for example, just the fact that Christopher Alexander, he has to write in his fourth volume, The Luminous Ground of the Nature of Order. He's like, well, I've kind of been keeping the secret, guys. I've been using this quite rational way of describing what makes buildings whole and so on. But I just got to come out and say it, that that's all valuable, and it's connected, but there's something which is transcendent. There is this luminous ground, and there's that really we're feeling as architects, that we're trying to sense into, that we're trying to feel towards when we build something whole and beautiful and timeless. And so that one aspect of the future paradigm is something, when you go and see an art, to put it most concretely, that Chris Alexander is not having to hide out. Chris Alexander is not someone who never gets to build a building, and basically he lives in a world that's dominated by modernism and postmodernism. But you go to an ordinary architect about building, and if we saw how this paradigm would look, it would be things like, we don't have rules and regulations about how we have building. We have patterns and principles. Some of those patterns are the most fundamental.
Yes, I want to take a point because I think there is still many things unresolved with question marks of what would be the religions of the future, what would be our relationship to the sacred. It would probably encompass that sense of interbeingness, wisdom, complexity. I think once, and so there is also a question about what would those ethics look like. Um, and I do,
Can
I
I,
did
can I
no, no, sorry. I'm being strong to not be interrupted here. Um, I think there's also some people will wonder also, well, how do we guarantee that what we're dreaming does not become the future generation's nightmare. Um, and I think it is a very important question to ponder around, um, to set, to, and I think one, everything's at some point, every system and culture or living organism have a growth, a being born phase that is very vulnerable, a growth phase, and a decay phase in the rhythm of life. Um, and and so there is no perfect forms, there is no perfect recipe, there is no certainty of uh, how this dream cannot become a nightmare, and yet there are safeguards. There are safeguards to have principle about non-dogmatism. There are principles around non-violence that can be very powerful and important safeguard. um, and yet it will still be the responsibility to each generation to, while holding ground, to have the ability to question, and but that question at the service of life, not a questioning just to destroy, but in service. And is there any other point you'd like to cover, Rufus, before I'd like to maybe now come to a conclusion and wrapping?
Yes. So just to reiterate your point, I think it's just so key that even in all of this, but especially relating this discussion about the return of the sacred religion, I think key principles we could feel of the future is this non-dogmatism and non-oppression. So non-dogmatism means I always acknowledge that that I don't have the truth, that there will be error, there will be things to improve and evolve. And the non-oppression is that I'm not going to ever use violence, and not just physical violence, but other kinds of violence to impose the views I have would be elements of any future thing. And I think that's one very good point of transcending some of the cultural forms of the embodiment of sometimes the sacred in the past, how they've kind of become calcified, you might say, is that they have done that. And I think that leads to one point at the end. It's like, I think Ken Wilber makes this point really well. It's like if you ask like one thing, he would say like integral civilization, or the next stage is this aspect of realizing that there's always evolution. So there is never, it's not like Marx, where once there was the communist state, that was the end. What we're doing will be better, we hope. It's a spiral. We're improving. We're not just going back and forth. We are spiraling, we hope, in some sense, forwards. But it's a mountain with no top. And just as so I think this point is really beautiful. The other thing that will be in this future paradigm is a recognition of that. In many few times, it's always like ours is the best now. Now we've done it. The liberal democratic state is the end of time.
Yes,
That
no,
will not be the case.
that
Constant.
there is a constant evolution, and I think actually touched to one that we didn't cover, which is that sense of maybe instead of material growth, that there is a inner growth, and that inner growth obviously touches a spiritual dimension, a cognitive dimension, um, uh, like a growth. In order to grow, we need to be able to free ourselves also from our shadows. But therefore, moving that actually what brings us fulfillment is not just this material growth that we uh, had, but it's also an inner growth. And actually, when touching about the sense of a safeguard, but obviously beyond modernity, there has been a paradigm or a system of a more masculine, male dominating culture that we've been swimming in. And that has caused a lot of violence also to men and to female and women. And I think there's a reckoning that is already emerging, that the and it's related to the sacred, because if one value life and sees the sacred, uh, who are the nurturer and birther of life and the feminine? Um, and so I think the obvious it seemed for me it's so obvious that I almost forgot to mention that. Um, but there must be also a real integration of the power of the feminine, and an integration of the power of the feminine, um, that also, because there is also violence in the feminine, but I think a lot of that violence has been an integration of the violence that it has experienced of over thousands of years. And so it wants to also safeguard to not turn into a reactivity against the masculine. But often when there's been um, suffering and oppression for a long time, one cannot be surprised that at the begin there is an eruption also of violence also that comes out. Um, but we don't want, people use the term toxic masculinity the way you also have toxic femininity. But what I'm trying to point to is it is really clear, at least to me personally, that in this future I'm dreaming of is a future where the feminine power can come out unapologetically and fully. Um, that women and the feminine is more corporative in general. And in a world where we have the ability to blow the planet up with our nuclear weapon, with our AI, we have to be able to cooperate. And if there's, and I think the feminine energy is going to be really crucial in this ability um, to cooperate and to be in the service of life. That does not, by the way, mean that all women or feminine are at the service of life, but there is a reckoning with that key uh, energetic field that has to play a real massive importance in this renewal. Because if we're talking about rebirth, who gives birth? Women give birth.
Mm.
Uh, and if we,
Yeah.
females give birth.
Wow. Yeah. So the reintegration and the reprioritization of the feminine is a key aspect of this emerging, potentially a key aspect of this emerging paradigm.
Yes, and we can maybe have follow-up call, like interview,
Yeah, I think this is
what
yeah.
that implies, what that looks like. Uh, yes, and Nessie wrote in that. Thank you so much for everyone for listening to us today. This was just us dreaming and us sensing together what is it that we see uh, emerging or wanting to be born. It is not maybe the only path. Other people might sense other dimension, and it's very much welcome to add to the flavor to sense that complexity together. Um, and we wanted to share with you that this is what we sense that wants to be born. This is what we sense is on the other side of the mountain, like a dawn kind of coming. And before you see the sun fully, you first see the first rays of suns. And these are the first rays of sun that we're, seeing. And also that dream that we carry, that we want to carry with others and create with others. And we're very much aware that while wanting to live that dream, to not make the present moment a nightmare either. So thank you so much for listening to us. In the following episode, we'll probably start to actually go back a little bit deeper into, like, really digging deeper into the water we swim in of modernity. Like when we talk about, rationality, what does that really mean? What does that look like? Or equality? Because if we are to kind of like sense a new paradigm, we have to first acknowledge and see how deep the waters we're swimming in. So thank you for listening to us, and stay in touch. You've been listening to Over the Mountains with Rufus Pollock and Sylvie Shiwe Barbier at Life Itself.